This is Framed, and I'm your host, Dr. Julie Hunt. Today, we're exploring one of the most consequential episodes in modern American political life, the Watergate scandal. It's a story of power, secrecy, betrayal, and the media's essential role in holding authority to account. But most of all, it's a story about framing, how language, symbols, and narratives shaped not only the scandal itself, but the way Americans understood government, truth, and corruption for decades afterwards. It's just after 2 a.m. on June 17, 1972. 5 men are arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, located in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. They're carrying cameras, wiretapping devices, and cash tied to President Nixon's re-election campaign, the Committee to Re-elect the President, known ironically as CREEP. What initially looks like a petty break-in turns out to be a thread that once pulled will unravel a presidency. Nixon's inner circle quickly moved to contain the damage, and that's where the first frame emerged, the containment frame. They called the burglary a third-rate break-in. They dismissed it as overzealous campaign workers. But behind closed doors, hush money flowed, investigations were derailed, and the machinery of secrecy turned. It was not a criminal break-in being covered up. It was the corrosion of public trust itself. Behind the scenes, White House scrambles. Nixon's aides, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Dean, and Charles Colson begin constructing a containment frame. In communication theory, a containment frame is designed to limit perception, to reduce a scandal to a few bad apples, rather than a systemic failure. Nixon insists that the White House had no involvement. However, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, veterans of the CIA and FBI, ran the so-called plumbers, tasked with stopping leaks, and their operations unraveled spectacularly. Eventually, John Dean, the young White House counsel, begins keeping careful notes. Those notes and Dean's testimony will help bring the entire cover-up into daylight. While the administration attempts to maintain its containment frame, two young Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, begin their own investigation. The Watergate story might never have broken open without Woodward and Bernstein. Assigned initially to cover what looked like a minor burglary, they instead uncovered a trail of connections that led directly to the White House. Woodward and Bernstein slowly reframed the story from a simple break-in to a systemic abuse of power. Each article chipped away at the administration's preferred narrative of a third-rate burglary. They relied on a network of confidential sources, the most famous being Deep Throat, later revealed as FBI Associate Director Mark Felt. Felt's guidance, follow the money, became an enduring symbol of investigative persistence and the journalistic role in democratic accountability. The Washington Post editors, particularly Ben Bradlee, framed the newsroom's mission around verification, credibility, and public interest, despite intense pressure from the Nixon administration. This created a powerful counterframe to the White House's attempts at containment and discreditation. In doing so, Woodward and Bernstein embodied what communications scholar W. Lance Bennett later described as the spiral of scandal. As one revelation led to another, the frame expanded. What began as a burglary story spiraled into a national reckoning over presidential integrity and the boundaries of executive power. The reporting didn't just uncover wrongdoing, it reshaped how journalism defines its democratic duty. The Watergate coverage established investigative journalism as a watchdog institution, a frame of vigilance that has guided generations of reporters confronting power ever since. Their persistence reframed Watergate again, from politics to morality. As the press pursued truth, the scandal transformed into a national debate over honesty and power. This was the media's frame: accountability through exposure. W. Lance Bennett, a communication and political science scholar, examined how the media's logic of news values and political competition can turn isolated misdeeds into enduring narratives of corruption. He called this dynamic the spiral of scandal. The spiral of scandal describes how media-driven revelations amplify a crisis through repeated exposure, moral escalation, and narrative deepening. It's often grounded in John Thompson's work on media and moral scandals. Thompson argues that scandals expand as visibility increases. The media's logic of exposure fuels moral outrage, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. At its core, Bennett argues that a scandal is not a single event. It's a process driven by the interaction of three forces. Those three forces are political actors who maneuver to deflect blame or exploit the scandal for advantage, journalists who pursue incremental revelations to sustain audience interest, and public reaction, which keeps the story alive through outrage, curiosity, and moral debate. Each new revelation triggers another round of coverage, which pressures politicians to respond, which then generates more coverage, creating a self-reinforcing loop, hence a spiral. Watergate is practically Bennett's case study come to life. What began as a third-rate burglary quickly spiraled as the White House issued denials, the Washington Post revealed new layers of evidence, and congressional and judicial inquiries added fresh revelations. Each step amplified public distrust, deepening the scandal's moral weight. Bennett shows that the frame of scandal, corruption, cover-up, betrayal, becomes more important than any single act. The focus shifts from what happened to what it says about power itself. From a framing perspective, the spiral of scandal is a special case of frame reinforcement. Early frames define the moral tone: abuse of power, culture of secrecy. Subsequent stories reinforce those frames by fitting new facts into the same moral narrative. Competing frames, political witch hunt, heroic press, may emerge, but the scandal spiral tends to privilege drama and conflict. Once visibility begins, the process feeds itself. Every revelation sparks new outrage. Every headline invites more scrutiny. The scandal spirals, and democracy purges itself through exposure. That spiral, first seen in Watergate, now defines the modern political cycle. I read Contra, Monica-gate, Russia-gate. All reenact the same ritual: revelation, judgment, consequence. Each one echoes the Watergate frame, where the story of the scandal becomes bigger than the event itself. It's a warning that in a mediated democracy, political accountability can depend as much on narrative momentum as on actual wrongdoing. Each revelation leads to another. Each denial produces fresh scrutiny. The administration's own defensive framing, calling the press witch hunters and bias, ironically feeds the spiral further. Media scholars James Lowell and Stephen Heinerman argue that scandal narratives tend to follow ritualistic, almost theatrical patterns. According to them, every major scandal unfolds in 3 acts: revelation, judgment, and redemption. First comes revelation, the moment of exposure when private wrongdoing becomes public knowledge. The curtain lifts and the audience learns that a transgression has occurred. Then follows judgment, when journalists, politicians, and citizens weigh in, moralizing, condemning, or rationalizing the behavior. Finally comes redemption, the aftermath, where individuals or institutions attempt to reclaim legitimacy, often through apology, resignation, or reinvention. In this sense, scandal isn't just an interruption of normal life, it's a cultural ritual. It allows society to reassert its moral boundaries by collectively defining what counts as right and wrong. Ware and Linkkugel's Apologia typology gives us 4 classic strategies, often combined. These strategies are denial, it didn't happen, I didn't do it; bolstering, highlight positive traits or past service to offset the charge; differentiation, reframe the act as different from what accusers claim, not the same as; and then transcendence, place the act in a higher context or purpose, for national security or the greater good. William Benoit image repair theory is a more comprehensive menu used in politics and PR. They include denial, simple, shifting blame, evading responsibility, provocation, accident, defeasibility, good intentions, reducing offensiveness, bolstering, minimization, differentiation, transcendence, attacking accusers, compensation, corrective action, fix the problem, prevent recurrence, and mortification, accept responsibility, ask forgiveness. Apologia is a framework. It redefines problem, cause, morals, and remedy in the accused's favor. It tries to stop frame slippage and contain the spiral of scandal by stabilizing a narrative. In Nixon's case, early on was denial, no White House involvement; attack accusers, a witch hunt; bolstering, foreign policy wins; transcendence, national security, executive privilege. As evidence mounts, differentiation, mistakes versus crimes; evading responsibility, staff acted without my knowledge; some corrective action, resignations. And then the final phase, partial mortification, acknowledging mistakes in the resignation address, framed as protecting the nation. In crisis rhetoric, leaders deploy apologia, not a simple apology, but a strategic defense of character. Nixon's Watergate playbook moved from denial and bolstering to differentiation and limited mortification as the frame slipped beyond repair. The goal was to rekey the scandal from criminal conspiracy to managerial failure, while promising corrective action. In these cases, scandals become morality plays, opportunities to perform ethical renewal in full view of the audience. Political scientists Andrei Markovits and Mark Silverstein extend this argument into the political realm. They observe that democratic societies both condemn and depend on scandal. Condemn because corruption, abuse, and deceit threaten the legitimacy of government. Depend because exposing and punishing those violations reinforces the very principles democracy stands for: accountability, transparency, and moral order. As they put it, scandal is democracy's self-cleansing mechanism. Frame slippage occurs when the official narrative collapses under the weight of contradictory evidence. In Watergate, that moment comes with the revelation of the White House tapes. Nixon's own recordings, originally meant to preserve his legacy, become the instrument of his downfall. By 1973, televised Senate hearings turned the story into a public reckoning. John Dean warned of a cancer on the presidency. Senator Sam Erving held his pocket constitution aloft, symbolizing moral authority. If Watergate had a single moment when the frame shifted from a vague third-rate burglary to a full-blown constitutional crisis, it was John Dean's testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee in June 1973. Dean, who had served as White House counsel, was initially part of the inner circle, tasked with containing the scandal. His early role was to coordinate the cover-up, ensuring hush money reached the burglars, keeping investigators at bay, and maintaining a public narrative of denial. In Goffman's terms, Dean helped maintain the definition of the situation, protecting the official frame that Nixon's team wanted the public to see. But as investigations deepened and the walls began to close in, Dean made a fateful decision: to tell the truth fully and publicly. When he appeared before the Senate committee, the country stopped to watch. Millions of Americans gathered around their televisions as Dean, calm and deliberate, recounted the events in chilling detail. He described conversations with President Nixon about obstructing justice and paying hush money to the burglars, words that would later haunt the presidency. Dean's testimony provided a reframing of the entire narrative. Where the White House had insisted on a story of rogue operatives acting independently, Dean's account revealed a coordinated campaign of deception reaching into the White House and the Oval Office itself. The scandal was no longer about the break-in. It was about the abuse of power. His most memorable line came when he described the moral decay within the administration.
That there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I had let them very clearly know that I was not going to participate in the matter any further, and I thought it was time that everybody start thinking about telling the truth.
Became the defining metaphor of the Watergate era. It crystallized the scandal's moral and institutional stakes, making visible what had been hidden behind bureaucratic walls. Dean's testimony also changed how journalists and the public understood their roles. His inside perspective validated months of investigative reporting by the Washington Post, transforming what had been perceived as speculative journalism into confirmed fact. The frame of political witch hunt collapsed, replaced by the frame of truth-seeking accountability. John Dean's testimony marks the pivot from containment to exposure. His narrative became the organizing lens through which later revelations, the tapes, the resignations, the president's downfall were understood. In that moment, the symbolic boundaries shifted. The frame of loyalty gave way to the frame of legality. Truth-telling, once framed as betrayal, became the very measure of patriotism. Then came the turning point. Alexander Butterfield revealed that Nixon had secretly taped Oval Office conversations.
Are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
Approximately the summer of 1970. I cannot begin to recall the precise date.
Mr. Butterfield, as far as you know from your own personal knowledge, from 1970 then until the present time, all of the President's conversations in the offices mentioned and on the telephones mentioned were recorded. As far as you know.
That's correct, until I left.
The containment frame collapsed. The new frame was transparency, the demand to know what was on those tapes. Sometimes history turns not on the powerful, but on the quiet man in the corner, the one nobody expected to speak. That man was Alexander Butterfield. Butterfield was a career Air Force officer turned presidential aide. A deputy to H.R. Haldeman, Richard Nixon's chief of staff. In that role, he managed the president's daily schedule and oversaw many of the small logistical details of the Oval Office. He wasn't a political strategist or one of the famous plumbers. He was an administrator, discreet, professional, and largely invisible to the public. That changed on July 16, 1973, during the televised Senate Watergate hearings. The committee staff had been carefully questioning White House aides to see who might have first-hand knowledge of the president's involvement. When a staff attorney asked Butterfield whether any conversations in the Oval Office were recorded, Butterfield hesitated for just a second and then said something that would change history. Everything was taped, as long as Nixon was in the office. With that single sentence, the entire course of the Watergate investigation shifted. Butterfield revealed that President Nixon had installed a secret voice-activated taping system, one that had automatically recorded thousands of hours of meetings and phone calls. What had been rumor and testimony could now be verified or contradicted by the president's own words. The tapes became the centerpiece of the scandal, the ultimate frame of truth. Journalists, investigators, and the public suddenly understood that the Watergate cover-up might be proven by Nixon himself. The tapes became symbols of both power and paranoia, of a presidency that trusted no one, not even itself. From a framing standpoint, Butterfield's revelation shifted the narrative once again. Up to that point, Watergate had been framed around testimony, Dean's words, the burglar's confessions, the committee's theories. But after Butterfield, the frame became evidentiary, about proof, verification, and trust in the recorded word. The scandal moved from he said to what's on tape. The tapes became the undeniable frame of truth. When the smoking gun tape reveals Nixon ordering the CIA to obstruct the FBI investigation, the containment frame disintegrates. In frame theory terms, the scandal's center shifts from a burglary to a presidency corrupted by power. When the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release the tapes, the truth was undeniable. He had personally approved the cover-up. The smoking gun tape shattered his presidency. Within days, Nixon resigned, the first U.S. president to do so. As Marine One lifted from the White House lawn, the image reframed American politics forever. Power humbled by exposure. In communication theory, this marks a moment of rekeying, when the original interpretive frame collapses and a new one takes its place. After Butterfield, Watergate was no longer just about politics, it was about truth and evidence. It was about whether the President of the United States could be heard in his own voice committing or condoning crimes. The fight over those tapes, the subpoenas, the refusals, the missing minutes, became the dramatic spine of the scandal, and for the American public, the existence of those recordings made Watergate feel both cinematic and terrifying. The president as both actor and narrator in his own undoing. When released, they proved obstruction of justice, and on August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned.